Rick Sanchez has been lying to you since the pilot. Not about the science, not about the adventures, about himself. The version of Rick that drinks too much and laughs at everything and tells you nothing matters, that is not who Rick Sanchez is. That is what Rick Sanchez built to survive being who Rick Sanchez actually is. Tonight, you are going to fall asleep to 100 years of the real story. From the garage where a happy man turned down infinite power to stay with his wife, to the empty patch of space where he said goodbye to the last memory of her 40 years later. Every universe he abandoned, every Rick he killed, the civilization he built in secret and walked away from, the revenge that fixed nothing, and the Morty who burned it all down just to be free. Welcome to Ricktopus. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. The man before the monster. Rick C-137's Life with Diane. Here is something the show never quite says out loud, but spends 8 seasons showing you through the wreckage left behind. Rick Sanchez was happy once. Not content, not numb, not drunk and brilliant and running from something. Actually, genuinely happy. The kind of happy that makes a person turn down the greatest offer in the history of the universe without a second thought, because what they already have feels like enough. That version of Rick existed. He was real. And understanding him, understanding exactly who he was before everything went wrong, is the only way to understand why everything that came after turned out the way it did. So before we get to the killing spree, before the Citadel, before Evil Morty and Rick Prime and 40 years of drinking to feel nothing, we need to sit with the man in the garage. The one working on teleportation technology in a house in the suburbs. The one with a wife named Diane and a daughter named Beth, and a life that, by any reasonable measure, looked like everything. That man is where this story starts. Rick C-137, the Rick the show follows, the Rick the audience spends 8 seasons with, grew up, fell in love, and built a quiet life around the people he loved. He married Diane. They had Beth. He became a scientist. Not the kind of scientist who tears holes in the fabric of reality and laughs about it, but the struggling kind. The kind who sits in a garage surrounded by half-finished machines and coffee cups and tries to figure out teleportation because the problem genuinely excites him. He was good at it. He was not yet the best at everything. He was a man with a project and a family and weekends, and none of that felt small to him. This is the detail the show makes you earn. It doles it out across seasons. A flash of memory here, a brain scan there, and when you finally put the picture together, what you find is not what you expected. You expected Rick's past to be dark, and it is, but the darkness did not come first. What came first was a person who had made a very deliberate choice about the kind of life he wanted, and that choice was this: the house, the garage, Diane calling him in from the other room, Beth growing up down the hall. That was the Rick Sanchez who existed before the show begins, and he was nothing like the one we meet. The thing that matters most about who Rick was before the bombing is not his intelligence. His intelligence was always there. What matters is what he chose to do with it. He was not traveling the multiverse. He was not building weapons for alien governments, or negotiating with gods, or blowing up civilizations for fun. He was trying to figure out teleportation in a garage, while his wife and daughter lived their lives 30 feet away. That was enough for him. He had decided, consciously, that it was enough. This matters enormously for everything that comes after. Because Rick C-137 is not a man who stumbled into his family by accident and then lost them. He chose them. He built his life around them on purpose. And when that life was taken from him, what broke was not just his heart. What broke was the entire framework of meaning he had constructed around the decision to stay. One day, and the show is deliberately vague about exactly when, though it happens while Beth is still a child, a stranger appeared in Rick's garage. The stranger was also Rick, a different Rick, a Rick from another dimension, one where this version of the problem Rick was working on had already been solved. This other Rick had figured out how to travel between realities. He had a portal gun. He had access to the entire infinite multiverse, every version of every place and every version of every person who had ever existed or would ever exist. And he showed up in C-137's garage to offer Rick a piece of it. The offer was real. The technology was real. This other Rick, the show eventually names him Rick Prime, though it takes several seasons to reveal his full identity, was genuinely extending an invitation. Come with me, the offer said. Leave the garage. Leave the suburbs. Leave the wife and the daughter and the half-finished project and come see what an infinite universe looks like when you have a portal gun and no rules and more intelligence than anything alive. Rick C-137 said no. He thought about it. The show lets you see him thinking about it, the pull of the offer, the scale of what was being dangled in front of him. But at the end of whatever that internal conversation looked like, he came back to the same same answer. He didn't want the infinite life. He thought it sounded lonely. He thought it sounded like the kind of thing you'd regret. He had Diane. He had Beth. He was working on a problem he cared about, in a house he loved, and the idea of trading all that for the ability to travel through reality forever sounded less like freedom and more like running, so he turned it down, and the other Rick left. What happens next is the pivot point of the entire show. The other Rick, Rick Prime, did not take the rejection well. The show implies, and later more or less confirms, that he found the refusal insulting. Here was a lesser version of himself. Same mind, same face, same raw intelligence. And this lesser version was acting like his small, quiet life in the suburbs was worth more than everything Prime was offering. That calculation offended him. The idea that a Rick could look at infinite power and choose a family instead was, to Rick Prime, not touching. It was a judgment. An implication that what Rick Prime had chosen for himself was wrong. So Rick Prime sent a bomb through a portal into Rick's garage. He meant to kill Rick. Or maybe he meant to kill Diane and Beth specifically, the things Rick had chosen over the offer. Because removing them would be removing the reason Rick had said no. The show leaves the exact intent slightly open. What is not open is what happened. The bomb went off and Diane and Beth died, and Rick survived with injuries. And the man who had been quietly working on teleportation in a garage because it excited him was suddenly alive in the wreckage of everything he had chosen to protect. What Rick does next is important to understand clearly, because the show is precise about it. He does not immediately build a portal gun and go hunting. He is injured. He grieves. He spends time alone. The trauma of what happened sits on top of him for a period the show does not put an exact number on, and during that period, he is simply a man in pain, with nothing left of the life he had built. Then, eventually, he gets up, he goes back to the garage, he goes back to the problem, and he solves it. Not because someone showed him how, not by copying Rick Prime's technology, but on his own, from scratch, fueled by grief and the specific cold focus that comes when a person has nothing left to lose and one very clear purpose. Rick C-137 invented interdimensional travel because someone murdered his family, and he needed a way to find them. This is one of the most quietly devastating facts in the entire show. The portal gun, the thing that makes Rick the most powerful being in the accessible multiverse, the thing that gives him access to infinite realities, the thing Evil Morty eventually moves heaven and earth to understand, the thing the Galactic Federation spent seasons trying to steal, was born out of grief. Every adventure the show has ever staged, every dimension they have ever jumped into, every impossible situation Rick has ever blasted them out of with a green portal, all of it traces back to a bomb in a garage and a father who survived it. He built the most powerful tool in the universe to find the man who took his family. That's it. That's the origin. Everything else is consequence. There is one more thing about this period that the show reveals slowly, and that matters deeply for understanding the Rick we actually spend time with. After Diane and Beth died, Rick kept their dimension frozen. He created a time loop around dimension C-137, the dimension where he had lived with them, where Beth had grown up, where he had built his life, and he locked it on the day of the bombing. The entire dimension, every person in it, every life that had been living inside it, trapped on the worst day of Rick's life, repeating it forever, because Rick could not let go of the moment he had lost them. The show reveals this in season 6. When Rick is accidentally sent back to his original dimension, he finds it still looping. His neighbor has been living the same day over and over for decades. And Rick, when he finally decides it is time to move on, when he decides that holding the whole dimension hostage to his grief has gone on long enough, releases the loop, which, given what the loop had been doing to the people inside it, gives most of them the relief of dying. That detail tells you something about the scale of what Rick was carrying. He did not just grieve, he restructured reality around his grief. He held an entire dimension still because he could not bear to let the world that contained Diane move forward without her. That is not nihilism. That is the opposite of nihilism. That is a man who cared so much, so completely, that the loss of the thing he cared about warped everything around him, literally, physically, in a way that the infinite multiverse could feel. The Rick who insists nothing matters froze a dimension for 20 years because something did. So who is Rick Sanchez really at the beginning of this story? He is someone who looked at infinite power and chose love instead, who built his intelligence into a family rather than a weapon, who, when that family was taken by the very thing he had refused, channeled every scrap of that intelligence into finding the man responsible, who was so unable to let go of what he had lost that he held time itself still around the memory of it. He is not the careless genius. He is not the nihilist who never cared about anything. He is a man who cared about one thing more than anything else in the universe, and who had that one thing destroyed by someone who thought caring was weakness. Everything the show gives you after this, every terrible thing Rick does, every dimension abandoned, every Morty put in danger, every relationship held at arm's length, every monologue about how nothing matters and feelings are chemical reactions and love is just biology lying to you, is a man trying to survive having been proven right that caring leads to loss. The monster the show built did not come from nowhere. He came from a garage and a wife named Diane and a choice to stay. That choice is what killed her and what made him. And what he does next, the thing he becomes in the years between that garage and the suburban house where the show begins, makes the monster make sense in a way that the nihilism never could. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because Rick C137 doesn't just grieve, he hunts. And what he becomes during that hunt is the thing the rest of the multiverse would spend years being afraid of. Section 2. The bomb in the garage. Rick Prime's act of spite and what it triggered. There is a version of this story where Rick Prime is a mystery. For most of the show's run, that is exactly what he is. The killer Rick. The one who showed up in the garage. The shadow behind everything that went wrong. The show drops pieces of him across seasons. A flash of memory, a brain scan, a rumor among other Ricks, and lets the audience construct him from fragments. For a long time, he exists the way real trauma exists, as a shape in the background that explains everything without being fully visible. But eventually, the show shows you all of him, and what you find is not a supervillain with a grand plan. What you find is something far more disturbing than that. Rick Prime is what Rick C137 could have been if he had never loved anyone. That is the comparison the show is making. That is why Prime matters. Not because he is powerful, though he is. Not because he is cruel, though he is that too. But because he is the answer to the question the show has been quietly asking since the pilot. What does a Rick look like when nothing ever got through to him? What does genius look like without grief to humanize it? What is left of a person who has every ability and no attachment? The answer is Rick Prime, and the answer is terrifying. To understand what Rick Prime did and why, you have to understand what he believed. Rick Prime had already solved interdimensional travel by the time he showed up in C137's garage. He had a portal gun. He had access to infinite realities. He had been out there, moving through the multiverse, doing whatever he wanted, going wherever he wanted, answering to nothing and no one. And somewhere in that experience, he had landed on a philosophy. Not the fake nihilism Rick C137 performs for protection, but the real thing. A genuine, bone-deep belief that the only thing worth being is free, that attachment is weakness, that family is a cage, that the right use of infinite intelligence is to go everywhere and belong nowhere and need no one. This is not a sad story to Rick Prime. This is the point. This is the correct conclusion that a smart enough person eventually reaches if they think about it clearly enough. In his view, Rick C137 was a smart person who had not yet thought about it clearly enough, and so he showed up in the garage to help him get there. The offer was not malicious. That is what makes it so unsettling. Rick Prime genuinely believed he was doing C137 a favor. He was showing a version of himself, a version that had gotten stuck, that had let himself get tangled up in a wife and a daughter and a house. The way out. Come with me. See what we can do when we are not holding ourselves back. The infinite multiverse is right here. All you have to do is leave. And Rick C137 said no. This is where Prime's philosophy collides with reality, and where the bombing becomes legible. Rick Prime did not experience the rejection as a difference of opinion. He experienced it as an insult. Because if C137 was right, if the quiet life in the garage was actually worth more than everything Prime was offering, then Prime's entire existence was a mistake. The choice Prime had made to leave his family and travel alone through the multiverse was only valid if it was the correct choice. A lesser Rick choosing a lesser life and being happy with it was not a neutral fact. It was a challenge to the whole structure of what Prime believed. So Prime could not just leave. He could not walk back through the portal and let C137 have his garage and his wife and his daughter and his little life. That would mean accepting that his own life, the infinite free one, might not be better. And that was not something Rick Prime was built to accept. What he did next, the show is slightly careful about. The exact intent behind the bombing, whether he wanted to kill Rick or kill Diane and Beth specifically to remove the reason for the refusal, or just wanted to cause damage and ran, is left with a small amount of room. But the result is not ambiguous. He sent a bomb through a portal into the garage. Diane and Beth died. Rick survived. And Prime disappeared into the multiverse. What makes this act so specifically awful is not just what it destroyed. It is what it was designed to do. If Prime wanted to punish Rick for refusing, killing Diane and Beth was the exact right move. prove, because it did not just hurt Rick, it proved Prime's point. It showed, in the most brutal way possible, what happens when you care about something. You lose it. You build your life around people, and then those people are gone, and you are left in a burning garage with nothing. The very thing Rick had chosen over the offer, love, family, attachment, had led directly to catastrophe. Prime may have intended this as a lesson. He may have told himself, in whatever passes for his inner life, that he was demonstrating something true, that he was showing C-137 what caring costs, that eventually, out of enough grief, C-137 would arrive at the same conclusion Prime had already reached, that nothing is worth holding on to, that the only safe thing is to need no one. The lesson landed, just not the way Prime expected. Rick did not become Prime. That is the crucial thing. He grieved. He built the portal gun from scratch, not copying Prime's work, but solving it himself from the ground up, alone in the same garage where everything had ended. He invented the most powerful tool in the accessible universe out of the wreckage of the life that tool had just been used to destroy. And then he went looking, not for freedom, not for adventure, not to see what the multiverse had to offer now that he had no reason to stay home. He went looking for the man who killed his family. This is the first and most important way Rick C-137 is different from Rick Prime. Prime's response to everything is to leave. His response to C-137's refusal was to leave after planting a bomb. His response to the existence of any obligation or consequence or person who might matter to him has always been to go somewhere else. Rick C-137's response to the worst thing that ever happened to him was to stay on the problem, to not let go, to spend the next several decades chasing one target across infinite realities because letting it go was not something he was capable of. That stubbornness, the refusal to move on, to let the wound close, to find a replacement Diane in some other dimension and start over, is the thing that makes C-137 who he is. It is also the thing that makes him dangerous. Because a Rick with infinite intelligence and infinite access and nothing left to protect except a purpose is a Rick that is very hard to stop. There is something else Rick Prime did, something the show holds back until season 7, that makes the bombing look almost small by comparison. After the initial killing, after the garage, Prime did not consider the matter closed, because other Ricks eventually started doing what C-137 did. They built portal guns. They came looking for him. They had lost their Dianes too, not to his bomb specifically, but to their own various catastrophes, and they blamed Prime, and they hunted him the same way C-137 hunted him. And Rick Prime, faced with an ever-growing number of angry Ricks chasing him across the multiverse for the crime of making them hurt, built a solution. He called it the Omega Device. The Omega Device was a weapon unlike anything else in the show's history. It did not just kill someone, it erased them. A person hit by the Omega Device ceased to exist not just in one reality, but across every reality. Every version of that person in every dimension wiped from existence simultaneously. One use of the device and a person was gone from the entire multiverse, forever, in every possible version of events. Rick Prime used it on Diane. Not on the Diane in C-137, she was already dead, killed in the original bombing. He used it on all the others. Every Diane Sanchez in every dimension the Omega Device could reach, gone, erased. Every version of the woman Rick had chosen over the offer, removed from the multiverse entirely. This is why, across the entire run of the show, you never see an alternate Diane. Other characters have variants. There are infinite Beths, infinite Mortys, infinite Summers and Jerrys, and even infinite Ricks. But Diane does not appear in alternate form. The show plants this absence quietly, so quietly that most viewers miss it for seasons. It is only when the Omega Device is revealed that the absence finally has an explanation. She was not missing from the show because the writers forgot about her. She was missing because Rick Prime made sure there was no version of her left to find. The weapon also did something the show reveals in season 8. When the Omega Device erases a person, it does not just remove them from existence. It damages the memories of everyone who knew them. Rick, after season 7, does not have clear memories of Diane. Beth does not really remember her mother. They have fragments, suggestions, the feeling that someone was there without being able to clearly see who. The Omega Device turned the most important person in Rick's life into a blur, something he knows he lost but can no longer fully see. Prime wiped Diane from reality, and then wiped her from the minds of the people who had loved her. So what was Rick Prime actually trying to accomplish? The show gives you a few different ways to read this, and they are not mutually exclusive. One reading is simple spite. He killed Diane across the multiverse because other Ricks kept coming after him for revenge, and removing the thing they were avenging was a way to end the chase. No Diane to mourn, no reason to keep hunting. It is the logic of someone who sees people as problems to be solved, rather than humans to be understood. Another reading is darker. The show hints that Prime may have used the Omega Device partly on himself herself, or at least that removing Diane from every reality may have been as much about removing her from his own experience as punishing anyone else. Because Rick Prime had a Diane once too. He had a family in his own dimension that he abandoned, and the fact that he built a weapon powerful enough to erase someone from all of existence and then used it specifically on the one person every Rick had ever loved, that is not a neutral choice. That is a man trying to make something stop hurting by making it stop existing. If that reading is right, then Rick Prime and Rick C-137 are more similar than either of them would want to admit. Both of them responded to the weight of Diane by trying to make the weight go away. One froze a dimension to preserve the memory. The other built a weapon to erase it. Two versions of the same grief going in exactly opposite directions. What the bomb in the garage actually triggered then is not simply a revenge story. It is a collision between two philosophies that happen to share a face. Rick Prime believed that freedom from attachment was the highest good, and that anyone who disagreed was making a mistake. Rick C-137 believed that attachment, Diane, Beth, family, home, was worth more than all of the power the multiverse could offer. The bomb was Rick Prime's argument. It was him making the case, in the most violent possible way, that caring leads to loss, and therefore, caring is wrong. Rick C-137 spent the next 40 years building a counter-argument, not with words, with everything he did and everywhere he went and every decision he made that pulled him back toward people when his stated philosophy insisted he should pull away. The bomb created the Rickest Rick. But it did not create Rick Prime's version of the Rickest Rick, the one who truly does not care, who has no attachment left, who moves through the multiverse like a force of nature with no center. It created something more complicated than that, a man who cares too much and knows it is going to destroy him and cannot stop. And what he does with that impossible combination, caring infinitely and surviving infinitely and hunting endlessly, across the decades between the garage and the first episode of the show, is where this story goes next. __quote_1__. Because the killing spree Rick C-137 went on looking for Prime was not clean. It was not targeted. It was not surgical. He went through Rick after Rick after Rick across the multiverse, looking for the one who had done it, and the trail he left behind was something the entire multiverse would eventually have to reckon with. Section 3. The Killing Fields. Rick's decade-long rampage across the multiverse. Picture what it actually means to have a portal gun and nothing left to lose. Not in the adventure sense, not in the fun sense that the show usually plays it. The green flash, the new dimension, the wild problem to solve and laugh about on the way home. Strip all of that away. Take the humor out. Take the family out. Take the house and the garage and the reason to come back out. What you are left with is a man who can go anywhere, who has the most powerful tool ever invented, and who has one single purpose that he will not put down under any circumstances. That is what Rick C-137 was for the better part of several decades before the show begins. Not an adventurer, not a scientist on a journey of discovery, a man with a list and a portal gun, and the willingness to work through the list for as long as it took. The list was every Rick in the multiverse who might be the one who killed his family. And he worked through it the only way that made sense to someone in his state. He killed them. The mechanics of what Rick was doing during this period matter, because they explain why the hunt went on so long and cost so much. When Rick invented the portal gun, he also developed some way to identify the specific Rick he was looking for, a kind of marker based on the killer's biology, a way to test whether any given Rick was the one. The show does not spell out exactly how this worked, but it confirms the process. Rick had a method, he applied it, and every single time the answer came back wrong. So he moved to the next one, and the next one, and the next one after that. The show's brain scan sequence in season 5 shows this period as a montage, and the montage is deliberately overwhelming. Rick moving through dimension after dimension, Rick finding another version of himself, Rick testing, confirming it is the wrong one, and then not walking away. The kills stack up, dozens. Then what looks like hundreds, possibly more than that. The show does not give a firm count, and the implication is that the number is large enough that counting feels beside the point. Every one of those Ricks was, in some sense, innocent of the specific crime Rick was hunting. They were not the one who bombed the garage. They were alternate versions of the same person, same face, same voice, same raw intelligence, but living different lives in different dimensions, none of which included murdering Diane and Beth in C-137. Rick knew this. He tested them specifically to confirm which one was the killer, and when they came back not guilty of that crime, he killed them anyway. The show does not explain this choice in detail, because it does not need to. You can feel the logic of a grief this large and this broken. Every Rick that existed was a version of the man who had shown up in that garage. Every Rick shared the face. Every Rick was, in some dimensions dimension somewhere capable of what Prime had done, because Prime was a Rick too. The line between guilty and innocent was blurry in a way that grief made blurrier, and somewhere in the months or years after the bombing, Rick stopped drawing it clearly. What the rampage did to Rick personally is something the show is careful and specific about. He became depressed. Not the performed depression that Rick uses as armor in the main series, the theatrical self-loathing that functions as a way to keep people at a distance, but actual, heavy, sustained depression. The kind that settles in when a person has been doing something painful for too long without finding what they were looking for. Rick was not getting closer to the answer. He was not narrowing the field in any meaningful way. He was moving through infinite realities hunting an infinite target, and infinite targets do not get smaller no matter how many you cross off. He started drinking during this period, not as the casual, constant background habit that the show normalizes in its present-day Rick, but as a response to the specific pain of what was happening to him. The alcohol was not about fun. It was about the gap between what he was doing and what he was feeling, and the need to make that gap survivable. He had built the portal gun to find the man who killed his family. He had thrown himself into the hunt as the only thing that gave the grief a direction, and the hunt was not working. It was just killing, endlessly, without resolution. The gap between what he was doing and why he had started doing it grew wider with every dimension he moved through, and the drinking grew with it. There is a detail from this period that the show reveals quietly, and that lands hard once you notice it. Rick was not just killing alternate versions of himself during the rampage. He was also meeting them. Not every encounter ended in death. Some of them were brief, long enough to test and confirm the wrong answer. But across decades of moving through the multiverse, Rick C-137 encountered countless versions of his own life. Ricks who had made different choices. Ricks whose Dianes were still alive. Ricks who had never invented the portal gun and were still sitting in their garages working on teleportation with no idea what they were missing. Ricks who were happy. The show does not dwell on what it cost Rick to see those versions of himself. It does not need to. You can do that math yourself. A man who lost the thing he loved most, wandering through infinite realities where the thing he lost is still alive and whole, and moving on without touching it because stopping would mean abandoning the purpose that is keeping him going. He never went to a dimension where Diane was alive and stayed. This is confirmed in the show. Later, when asked why he never just found a dimension with a living Diane and rebuilt his life there, the answer is complicated but real. He had already removed those universes from his search, because the specific Rick he was hunting, Rick Prime, would not be in a universe where Diane survived. The universes with living Dianes were the wrong universes for his purpose, so he cut them out of his search. He chose the hunt over every living Diane in the multiverse. Let that settle. He had access to infinite versions of the woman he was avenging. He could have stopped. He could have found her somewhere and had something close to what he lost. He chose not to. He chose the chase, because stopping would mean accepting that he was never going to find the real answer, and that the thing he had been doing for however many years was not justice, but just pain wearing purpose like a costume. He was not ready to accept that, so he kept moving. Eventually, the other Ricks noticed. You cannot kill hundreds of alternate versions of the same person without the remaining versions figuring out that something is happening. The multiverse is infinite, but the community of Ricks, the ones with portal guns, the ones who were aware of other dimensions and other versions of themselves, was smaller than infinity. Word spread. Rick C-137 was out there. Rick C-137 was moving through dimensions, and he was not being careful, and he was not being subtle, and he was leaving a trail of dead Ricks behind him that was impossible to miss. The other Ricks organized. This is exactly as difficult as it sounds. Getting a group of Ricks to cooperate on anything requires overcoming the fact that each of them believes he is the smartest person alive, and therefore the most qualified to be in charge, and therefore not interested in taking direction from anyone else. But the threat was significant enough that they managed it anyway. They put together something like a coalition. Multiple Ricks from multiple dimensions, combining resources and information and tactical planning, and they sent teams after C-137 to stop him. Rick killed those teams too. Every alliance the other Ricks formed, C-137 dismantled. Every strike team they sent, he defeated. He was, at this point, operating at a level that even other Ricks could not match. Not because he was inherently smarter than all of them, but because grief and desperation and years of practice at surviving impossible situations had made him into something none of them were prepared for. He had been moving through the multiverse alone, at war with everything, for long enough that fighting had become the only thing he was still good at. The show describes him during this period with a specific phrase, the Rickest Rick. It is the most extreme version of what a Rick can be, and the other Ricks used it partly as a warning and partly as a label for something they did not fully understand. How do you you fight the Rickest Rick, you are also a Rick. You also think you are the smartest person alive. You also have a portal gun and an enormous amount of confidence. None of that was enough. He beat them every time. The coalition that formed to stop him became the coalition that admitted it could not stop him. And the admission that came after that C-137 had won, that he was beyond what any organized group of Ricks could handle, that the only remaining option was to stop fighting and start negotiating, was the beginning of something that would shape the entire rest of this story. Before we get to the negotiation, there is something important to sit with about what Rick had become by this point in the story. He had not found Rick Prime. After all of it, all the dimensions, all the kills, all the years of moving and hunting and drinking and refusing to stop, he still had not found the specific Rick he was looking for. The one answer the whole effort was designed to produce had not arrived. The hunt had consumed decades of his life and produced an enormous amount of death and changed him in ways that would never fully reverse. And at the end of all of it, the target was still out there. This is the thing about the Rampage that the show wants you to understand. It was not a success. It was not a failure in the clean sense either. It was something grimmer than either of those. A person doing an enormous amount of damage in pursuit of a result that the damage was never actually going to produce. Rick could have killed every Rick in the multiverse except the right one and still not gotten what he was after. The hunt was not a path to the destination. It was what happened when a person had a destination and no real way to reach it and could not stop moving anyway. What it produced, beyond the death toll, was the man the show introduces in the pilot. The Rick who drinks constantly and claims nothing matters and holds everyone at arm's length and performs not caring as a full-time project, that Rick was built in the killing fields. He is what you get when someone spends decades doing something that costs everything and provides nothing, and refuses to examine whether the thing was worth doing because examining it would require stopping. The nihilism is not a philosophy, it is armor, and the armor was built during the Rampage, one dead Rick at a time, out of the specific material of a man who cared too much and could not make that caring do anything useful. There is one more thing the Rampage produced that the show does not make explicit until later, but that was present the whole time. Rick joined the rebellion against the Galactic Federation during this period. Somewhere in the years of moving between dimensions, he found Bird Person and Squanchy and a cause that was big enough to point his energy at. The Galactic Federation was a massive organization that controlled huge parts of the universe, and the rebellion against it was dangerous and real and gave Rick somewhere to put the version of himself that still, despite everything, wanted to fight for something. The show eventually shows you Rick and Bird Person young, fighting together, before everything got this heavy, before the Rampage had fully made Rick into what he was becoming. And what you see in that younger Rick is someone who had not yet closed off entirely, someone who still had enough left in him to mean something to another person, to be a real friend, to fight for a cause because he believed in it. The rebellion did not last forever for Rick. He eventually walked away from it too, became disillusioned, stopped believing the cause was worth the cost, chose the hunt over the war. But the friendships he made there, especially with Bird Person, stuck in a way that almost nothing else did. They are some of the only relationships Rick carries into the present day of the show that are not contaminated entirely by the Rampage. The version of Rick that Bird Person knew, the one who was still capable of real connection, is the version the show keeps returning to when it wants to show you that the monster was not always a monster. By the time the other Ricks stopped fighting and started talking, Rick C-137 had been on the hunt long enough that the multiverse had shaped itself around him. Other Ricks feared him. The Galactic Federation wanted him. The dimensions he had moved through were permanently changed by his presence, and he was no closer to finding Rick Prime than he had been the day he finished the portal gun in a burnt-out garage with nothing left. What came out of the negotiation with the other Ricks, the peace treaty, the construction project, the enormous compromise that Rick agreed to in exchange for them stopping their attempts to kill him, would become one of the most important structures in the entire history of the multiverse. But it came with a hidden cost, and it revealed something about Rick C-137 that he would spend the rest of the show trying to hide. __quote _2__. Even at the height of the Rampage, even at the moment when he was the most feared thing in the accessible universe, Rick was still trying to find a way home to someone. Section 4. The Truce. Why Rick founded the Citadel and then abandoned abandoned it. At some point, even Rick C-137 ran out of road. Not because he gave up, not because the grief faded or the purpose disappeared, or he woke up one morning and decided the hunt was not worth continuing. None of that happened. The purpose was still there. The target was still out there. The portal gun still worked, and the dimensions were still infinite. And Rick was still, on some deep level that he would never fully admit to, the man in the garage who had chosen his family over everything and lost them anyway. But the war with the other Ricks had reached a point where continuing it made no practical sense. He had beaten every team they sent. He had dismantled every coalition they formed. He had proven repeatedly and decisively that no organized group of Ricks could stop him. And the other Ricks, being Ricks, were smart enough to eventually do the math on that and arrive at the only conclusion the math supported. They could not win. So they stopped trying to win and started trying to deal. The negotiation that produced the Citadel was not a warm conversation between equals who had decided to set aside their differences. It was a surrender dressed up as a partnership. The other Ricks came to Rick C-137 because they had no better option, and Rick agreed to stop killing them because a truce served his purpose better than the war did. His purpose had not changed. He was still looking for Rick Prime, and the war with the other Ricks was pulling his attention away from that search without producing the target. Every team he had to fight was time not spent hunting. Every dimension he had to defend against a coordinated attack was energy not pointed at the actual problem. The truce was not peace. It was Rick deciding that the other Ricks were more useful alive and organized than dead and scattered. What came out of the negotiation was an agreement to build something, a place, not tied to any particular dimension, existing in its own pocket of space, where Ricks and Mortys from across the multiverse could live, work, and be protected from the various things hunting them. The Galactic Federation was a real threat to any Rick operating in the open. The various enemies Rick and others had accumulated across their travels were real threats too. A shared home, a shared defense, a shared structure. In theory, it made sense for everyone. The Citadel of Ricks was built as that shared home. A massive space station, large enough to function as a city, populated entirely by Ricks and Mortys from infinite different realities. It had housing and jobs and its own economy and its own government, the Council of Ricks, a group of Ricks who managed the whole operation. It was, in the most literal sense, a civilization built by and for the smartest people in their respective universes. Rick C-137 was central to its construction. He was, after all, the reason the other Ricks had organized in the first place. His involvement in building the Citadel was part of the truce, a signal that he was committed to the arrangement, that he was going to be a participant rather than a threat. And he did participate. He helped build it, but he also did something the other Ricks did not know about. While the Citadel was being constructed, Rick C-137 added something to it that was not in any agreement and not discussed with any of the other Ricks involved. Something built into the deepest part of the station's systems, a massive machine that used the same portal technology that powered the station itself, but pointed outward instead of inward. This machine was what the show eventually calls the central finite curve. What it did, in plain terms, was draw a border around a specific portion of the multiverse. On one side of the border, every dimension where Rick Sanchez was the smartest being alive. On the other side, every dimension where he was not. The machine walled off the Rick-dominant portion of the multiverse from everything else, making it impossible to portal into or out of the non-Rick dimensions without specifically defeating the barrier. The official explanation, the one that eventually became the story told within the Citadel, was that this was about protection, about keeping Ricks safe from threats smarter than them, about ensuring that the community of Ricks always had the upper hand in their own corner of the multiverse. But that was not why Rick C-137 built it. He built it to trap Rick Prime. Rick Prime had been moving freely through infinite dimensions, which was exactly what made him impossible to find. An infinite multiverse is a very good place to hide. But if you could wall off the portion of the multiverse where Rick was always the smartest being, which was the portion where Rick Prime would want to operate because Rick Prime was also a Rick who needed to feel superior, you made the hiding space smaller. You reduced infinite to merely enormous. You gave the hunt a border. It did not work. Rick Prime was smart enough and slippery enough that even an enormous, walled-off portion of the multiverse was enough space for him to disappear into. The central finite curve did not produce the target. It just made Rick feel like the search had a shape. The Citadel ran without him for a while, and that was always the plan. Rick C-137 was never going to be a permanent resident of the place he helped build. He was not interested in governance or community or the logistics of running a civilization for infinite versions of himself. Those things required the kind of sustained attention and investment that Rick reserved exclusively for the hunt. The Citadel was a solution to the problem of the other Ricks. Once that problem was solved, the Citadel could take care of itself. What eventually soured the relationship between Rick and the Citadel was not a single incident, but a slow accumulation of incompatibilities. The Council of Ricks governed in ways Rick disagreed with. The Citadel developed its own politics, its own hierarchies, its own injustices, the things that any civilization develops when it gets large enough and runs long enough. Mortys on the Citadel were treated as second class. The Council made decisions Rick found either stupid or self-serving. And the place, which had been built partly on the back of Rick's reputation and Rick's technology, increasingly operated as though Rick C-137 was just another resident rather than the reason the whole thing existed. Rick, being Rick, responded to this by leaving. He did not stage a dramatic exit or make a speech or try to reform the institution from within. He just stopped being there. He picked a dimension and moved into it, and the Citadel continued without him, and that was that. The dimension he chose was not random. He had found the original dimension of Rick Prime, the place where Prime had come from before he ever showed up in C-137's garage. And moving into that dimension, settling there, becoming a fixture there, was the closest thing to a strategic decision that Rick's grief had produced since building the central finite curve. The logic was simple, in the way that only grief logic can be simple. Rick Prime had a family in his original dimension, a daughter, Beth, a family that Beth had eventually built, a husband named Jerry, children named Morty and Summer. Rick Prime had abandoned all of them without a second thought, because that was the kind of Rick he was. But they were still there. They were still living in that dimension, in the house that Prime had walked out of. Rick C-137 moved in. His stated reason, at least to himself, was that Prime might come back, that the original dimension was the one place in the multiverse where Rick Prime might eventually return, and being there when he returned would give Rick the shot he had been chasing for decades. He was using the family as bait in the coldest possible reading of the situation. But the show makes clear, slowly and carefully across many seasons, that the coldest possible reading is not the only true one. Because Rick did not stay in that dimension like a hunter waiting at a trap. He stayed the way a person stays somewhere that starts to feel like home. He got attached to Beth. Not his Beth, but a Beth. To the kids. To the shape of having people around who needed something from him, and toward whom he felt, despite all his best efforts, something. He would never say that. The version of Rick the show introduces in the pilot would sooner perform open-heart surgery on himself than admit that he moved into a stranger's house because it felt, in some broken way, like the closest thing to what he had lost. But that is what happened. He came to wait for a killer and stayed because the family caught him the same way the first one had. Not by being perfect, not by being his, but by being people he could not make himself stop caring about. The Citadel ran on without its founder. The Council of Ricks governed. The Mortys lived in their designated spaces. The central finite curve held its border around the Rick-dominant multiverse. And the whole structure hummed along, growing and changing and developing problems that Rick was not around to see or care about. He had built an entire civilization as a side effect of a revenge mission and then walked away from it. The Citadel was the largest thing Rick C-137 ever made, and he abandoned it the way he eventually abandoned everything that was not the hunt. Not with malice, but with the particular indifference of a man who had one purpose and treated everything else as temporary. What he did not know, as he settled into the prime dimension and waited for a killer who was never going to come home, was that something was growing inside the Citadel that would eventually threaten everything he had ever built or cared about. __, quote _3 __. Someone inside that civilization had figured out the secret Rick had hidden in its foundation, and unlike Rick, they had the patience to wait decades for the right moment to use it. Section 5. The Central Finite Curve, the cage Rick built for everyone. The most important thing Rick C-137 ever built was not the portal gun. It was not any of the weapons he constructed during the rampage, or the technology he traded to alien governments during his years as an arms dealer, or even the portal gun improvements he made across the course of the show. Those things were powerful. Those things changed the shape of specific situations in specific dimensions. But none of them changed the shape of the multiverse itself. The central finite curve did. And the thing that makes it so worth sitting with, the thing that separates it from every other invention Rick has ever produced, is that it was not built to help anyone. It was not built to protect the Ricks who eventually lived behind it, though that became the official story. It was not built as an act of generosity or community, or even pure self-interest in the straightforward sense. It was built by a grieving man who needed the universe to be smaller, who needed the infinite to have a border, who could not psychologically survive the idea that the person he was hunting could be literally anywhere in all of existence. So he built a wall and told himself the wall made the search possible. The wall also made everyone inside it a prisoner. Rick just never fully reckoned with that part. To understand what the central finite curve actually is, you have to start with what it does in plain terms. The multiverse in Rick and Morty is genuinely infinite. Not almost infinite, not so large it might as well be infinite. Actually, truly, without limit infinite. Every possible reality, every possible version of every possible event existing simultaneously. Within that infinite multiverse, there are dimensions where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive. There are also dimensions where he is not. Dimensions where Jerry Smith is the most intelligent creature in his universe. Dimensions where Rick does not exist at all. Dimensions where the whole concept of a Rick-shaped person never developed. The central finite curve is a border that separates those two groups. On the inside of the border, every dimension where Rick is the smartest being alive. On the outside, everything else. The machine Rick built in the foundation of the Citadel uses portal technology to maintain this border constantly, making it impossible to travel between the two sides without specifically defeating the barrier. Every Rick who ever used a portal gun, which is every Rick in the Citadel, and every Rick who ever interacted with Citadel technology was, without knowing it, limited to the inside of a box that Rick C-137 had built and never told anyone about. Rick C-137 sits at the exact center of the curve. This is confirmed in the show. Of all the infinite Ricks inside the barrier, C-137 is the most extreme version, the one furthest toward whatever quality makes a Rick a Rick. He is, in the language the show eventually uses for it, the Rickest Rick, and the Rickest Rick is the point around which the entire structure is organized. He built a wall around the multiverse with himself at the center of it, and then he walked away and let other people live inside the wall he made without telling them the wall existed. The official story told within the Citadel about the central finite curve was that it existed for protection. Ricks are the smartest beings in their universes, but the broader multiverse, the infinite space outside the curve, contains things smarter than Rick. Beings and civilizations and forces that Rick would not automatically beat, that Rick could not automatically outthink, that Rick would have to genuinely worry about if he encountered them. The curve, in the official version, kept Rick safe from those things. It was a sensible precaution, a smart boundary drawn by smart people to protect themselves from a universe that was, beyond their corner of it, not organized around their advantage. The story is not entirely false. The curve does do that. The protection is real, but the protection was never the point. The point was the search. And the secondary effect of the protection, the thing that happened to every Morty who ever lived inside the curve, every version of Morty from every dimension contained within the barrier, was something Rick did not design intentionally, but that the show treats as his responsibility anyway. Every Morty inside the central finite curve spent their entire life in a portion of the multiverse built around the idea that Rick was the most important thing in it. Not just in their own dimension, across the entire accessible reality that their portal guns could reach. Every adventure, every dimension they could visit, every version of events they could access was inside a structure that put Rick at the center. The curve did not just protect Ricks. It organized the entire experiential multiverse of every Morty around the fact of Rick's dominance. Evil Morty, when he finally explains this to Rick's face, uses a specific image for it. He calls it an infinite crib built around an infinite baby. Every Morty who ever lived inside the curve spent every version of their life in a cage that Rick built. Not for them, not to hurt them, but as a side effect of Rick's need to feel like the most important thing in whatever space he occupied. The cage was not the goal, but the cage was real. Rick's reaction when Evil Morty lays this out is one of the most telling moments in the show. He does not deny it. He does not argue that the curve was for protection, or that the Mortys inside it were fine, or that Evil Morty is misreading the situation. He sits with it. And what sits on his face in that moment is not guilt exactly. Rick does not do guilt cleanly, but something in the same neighborhood. A recognition that the thing he built for one purpose had another effect he was either not aware of or not willing to look at directly. The central finite curve is the clearest example in the entire show of Rick using the people around him as furniture in his own story without quite meaning to. He did not build it to trap Mortys. He built it to find Rick Prime. But finding Rick Prime required limiting the multiverse, and limiting the multiverse required drawing a border. And drawing a border meant that everything inside the border was now a contained space, rather than a free one. Every Morty inside that space was living in a reality Rick had quietly closed off around them. This is the pattern the show returns to again and again when it looks at what Rick actually does to the people near him, as opposed to what he tells himself he is doing. He does not set out to harm them. He sets out to pursue pursue his own needs and his own purposes, and the harm happens as a consequence that he does not examine, because examining it would require slowing down. The curve is just the largest version of that pattern, galaxy-sized, multiversal, built in secret and maintained for decades without the knowledge of anyone living inside it. There is something else the central finite curve reveals about Rick that is easy to miss if you are focused on the political implications of the thing. It reveals that Rick does not actually believe his own philosophy. The version of Rick the show presents on the surface is someone who has concluded that nothing matters, that the universe is too big and too old and too indifferent to care about any individual life within it, and that the correct response to this conclusion is to stop pretending otherwise. This is what he says. This is the armor he wears. Caring is weakness. Attachment leads to loss. The only honest position is to look at the infinite universe and feel nothing. But the central finite curve is a man who could not handle the infinite universe, who looked at the genuine, actual, boundless infinite, every possible reality, every possible version of every possible thing, stretching in all directions without limit, and found it unbearable. Who responded to the infinity not with the confident nihilism he performs, but with the very human impulse to make things smaller, to draw a border, to turn the overwhelming into the manageable, to build a wall around the part of existence where he was the most important thing and stay inside it. That is not the behavior of someone who has made peace with the infinite. That is the behavior of someone who is afraid of it. Someone who needed the universe to have a shape that put him at the center, because the alternative, a genuine infinite that does not organize itself around him or anyone, that contains endless versions of events where he does not matter, was too much to sit with. He told the multiverse nothing matters, and then built the largest structure in the history of the multiverse to make sure he would always matter within it. The contradiction is not subtle once you see it. When Evil Morty finally broke through the central finite curve at the end of Season 5, using the Citadel itself as the machine to punch a hole in the barrier, the structural collapse of the curve was not just a physical event. It was the dissolution of the longest-running lie Rick had ever told. The lie was not told to the other Ricks, exactly. They knew the curve existed, even if they did not know its true origin story. The lie was told to Rick himself. The lie was that the wall made the search possible. That limiting the multiverse was a tactic in the hunt, rather than an admission that the hunt was too large for even Rick to handle without cheating. That the central finite curve was a weapon pointed at Rick Prime, rather than a security blanket wrapped around the man who had lost everything and could not make himself stop looking. When the wall came down, Rick was left in a genuinely open multiverse for the first time since the early days after the bombing. A multiverse without a border he had drawn. A multiverse that did not organize itself around his intelligence or his needs or his search. Just the real thing, infinite, indifferent, shaped by nothing he had built. He has been living in that open multiverse ever since, and the person doing that living is not the same person who built the wall. But before the wall came down, before Evil Morty got close enough to the Citadel to use it as his exit, something happened inside the Citadel itself that tells you everything you need to know about what Rick's abandoned civilization became when it grew up without him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The society he built in secret, behind a wall he never explained, produced something he did not plan for and could not fully understand. It produced a Morty who saw the wall clearly, and that Morty had been planning for a very long time. Section 6. The Croninberg Gambit. Why Rick chose to live as someone else's grandfather. Rick C137 is not Morty's real grandfather. The show does not hide this exactly, but it takes its time making it undeniable. It drops the information across multiple seasons in pieces small enough that you can absorb each one without fully feeling the weight of the whole picture. By the time the full picture arrives, you have been watching Rick and Morty interact for long enough that the revelation lands differently than it would have in the pilot. You have seen them go through enough together that the technical fact of their not being biologically related feels like it should change something, and then you realize it does not change as much as you expected, and that not changing is the show's whole point. But the mechanics of how Rick ended up in that house, with that family, in that dimension, those matter, because the choice Rick made when he picked the prime dimension to settle in was not a simple one, and it was not made for simple reasons, and understanding it requires understanding something about Rick's psychology that he would never voluntarily explain to anyone. Rick C137 needed people. He just needed to need them in a way that felt like strategy rather than weakness. The dimension Rick eventually settled in is the one the show starts in, the one the audience spends the first several seasons treating as the main reality. It is the dimension where Rick Prime was born and raised, where Rick Prime had a daughter named Beth who grew up without her father because Rick Prime left, where Beth eventually married a man named Jerry and had 2 children, Morty and Summer, and built a life in the absence of the Rick who should have been her father. Rick C-137 found this dimension during the Rampage years. He found it specifically because he was tracking Rick Prime, and Prime's original dimension was a logical place to watch. The reasoning was straightforward enough. Prime had left this dimension behind, but that did not mean he would never return. Dimensions have a pull. Origins have a pull. If Rick Prime ever got nostalgic or careless or had some reason to come back to where he started, C-137 wanted to be there when it happened. So he moved in. He took the place of the Rick who had abandoned that family. He walked into Beth's life and presented himself as her father. Not lying exactly, but not explaining the full truth either. He became Morty's grandfather in every practical sense. He built a lab in the garage. He started taking Morty on adventures. He became, from the outside, the Rick that this family had always been missing. The coldest version of this story is a hunter using a family as bait, sitting in a house and performing the role of grandfather while actually just waiting for the real grandfather to show up so he could kill him. Every meal at the table, a surveillance operation. Every adventure with Morty, a way to pass time while the trap stayed set. There is truth in that version. Rick himself, in his most self-protective moments, would probably describe it that way. It sounds like control. It sounds like purpose. It sounds like a man who has not lost his edge, who has not gotten soft, who is still running the operation even when the operation looks like family dinner. But the show is very careful about what it actually shows you, as opposed to what Rick says about it. The Rick who shows up in the pilot is not a man running a cold operation with emotional distance. He is a man who is already attached, already invested, already the kind of grandfather who shows up drunk in the middle of the night and pulls his grandson out of bed for adventures, which is a terrible thing to do to a 14-year-old, but is also not the behavior of someone who has successfully maintained professional detachment from the child. By the time the show begins, the gambit has already failed. Rick came to Prime's dimension to wait for a killer and ended up staying because the family got to him the same way the first family had. Not immediately, not without resistance, but eventually, in the way that things get to Rick when he stays in one place long enough, through proximity and repetition and the slow accumulation of moments that matter more than they should to a man who insists nothing matters. Morty is not his Morty. Beth is not his Beth. Summer and Jerry have no connection to his original life at all, and none of that stopped it from happening. There is a moment the show eventually confirms where a younger version of Rick, a version of him from inside Bird Person's memories, from before the Rampage had fully made him into what he became, reacts with open disgust to the idea of moving in with an abandoned Beth in another dimension. He calls the Ricks who do that creeps. He cannot imagine choosing that kind of substitute arrangement over the real thing. That younger Rick became the older Rick who did exactly that. And the gap between those two versions of him, between the Rick who found the idea of surrogate family pathetic and the Rick who built his entire present life around one, is the space where the show puts most of its emotional weight. There is a specific detail about how Rick ended up permanently in this dimension that the show reveals in Season 6, and it reframes everything that came before it. Early in the series, Season 1, Episode 6, Rick and Morty accidentally destroy their dimension. Morty had asked Rick for a love potion. The potion spread to the entire human population through a flu virus, and the result was a planet full of people physically mutated into monsters. Rick could not fix it. The situation was, in his own assessment, beyond repair, so they left. Rick found a dimension where an alternate version of himself had solved the same problem, had fixed the love potion mutation and restored the population, but where that dimension's Rick and Morty had died in the process of doing so. He and Morty slipped into that dimension and took the places of their dead alternates. They buried their own bodies in the backyard and carried on. This means that the Rick and Morty the show follows from episode 6 onward are not in the dimension the show started in. They are in a replacement dimension, a version of the same world, same family, same house, but not the original. The Morty that Rick had first started adventuring with is still back in the original dimension, which was left destroyed. The show confirms in Season 6 that this replacement dimension, the one Rick and Morty jumped into after the Croninberg disaster, is not the prime dimension either. It is a third location. Rick C-137, across the early seasons of the show, has moved the family he attached himself to twice. First from Prime's dimension to the Croninberg world's replacement, then the story of exactly which dimension they are currently in becomes even more layered when the portal gun resets in Season 6 and sends everyone back to their true dimension of origin. What this means in practice is that our Morty, the one the show has followed for its entire run, is confirmed to be Morty Prime, Rick Prime's actual biological grandson, the child that Rick Prime abandoned. Which means the relationship between Rick C-137 and Morty Prime is not just a surrogate arrangement by accident. Rick C-137 specifically ended up bonded to the actual grandson of the man he spent decades hunting. The show never lets Rick be fully comfortable with with what this means. Because if Morty is Rick Prime's real grandson, then the connection between Rick C-137 and Morty is not random. It is the mirror image of the original wound. Rick Prime killed C-137's family to punish him for refusing to leave his own, and C-137 ended up building a new family around Prime's abandoned son's son. The man who destroyed Rick's family accidentally gave Rick a replacement for it, and that replacement turned out to be the thing Rick could not make himself walk away from, even when walking away would have been simpler. Rick would never frame it this way. Rick would say he stayed because he was waiting.
Because it was tactical.
Because Morty was a useful companion for the kind of travel Rick needed to do, and the brainwave interference that Morty's presence provides, the way a Morty's specific brain signature cancels out a Rick's and makes them harder to detect, made keeping Morty around practical. All of that is technically true, and none of it is the real reason. The real reason is that Morty caught him, the same way Diane caught him, the same way Beth caught him. Rick C-137 is a man who keeps trying to need no one and keeps finding that he does. And the thing the show is quietly tracking across its entire run is what happens to a person who survives infinite loss by attaching to new people and then spends every day terrified of losing them the way he lost the first ones. He stays in the house because the house is the thing he has instead of the life that was taken, and he holds it at arm's length because holding it too close would mean admitting how much losing it again would cost. There is one more layer to the Croninberg gambit that the show confirms, and it is the saddest one. When Rick reset his portal gun in Season 6 and accidentally sent everyone back to their original dimensions, Morty ended up briefly back in his original world, the Croninberg dimension, the actual Prime dimension, the one where Rick C-137 had first settled in to wait for Prime. And what Morty found there was that his original family, the Summer and Beth who had been left behind when the Croninberg disaster happened, were dead. The dimension had not been kind to them after Rick and Morty left. Rick knew this was a possibility. He had left that family behind. He had made the calculation, back in Season 1, that the Croninberg disaster could not be fixed, and a clean exit was the only option. And he had made it in the same way he makes every calculation involving people he is attached to, with enough emotional distance that the calculation looks like logic rather than what it actually is, which is a man choosing which version of the pain he can survive. He chose wrong. Or rather, he chose in the way that someone chooses when they are trying not to feel the weight of what they are choosing. The Croninberg gambit was not a strategy. It was a grief response dressed up as a strategy. Rick picked the Prime dimension because it felt, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, like the closest available thing to the life he had lost. A Beth who needed a father, a grandchild he could take places, a house with people in it. He told himself it was a trap for a killer. It was actually a man who did not know how to stop wanting a family, finding the nearest available one, and moving in. And the Citadel he had left behind, humming along without him, governed by the Council of Ricks, full of Mortys living constrained lives inside a wall they did not know existed. That place was developing a problem that Rick's decision to settle down had left him perfectly positioned to miss entirely. __quote_5__. Something had gotten into the Citadel, something patient, something smart enough to understand what Rick had built and why, and cold enough to use that understanding as a weapon. Section 7. The Rise and Corruption of the Citadel, a society that mirrors its founder. The Citadel should have been perfect. Think about what it was, on paper. A civilization built entirely by the smartest people in their respective universes. No resource problems that the combined intelligence of infinite Ricks could not solve. No external threats that the same intelligence could not neutralize. No leadership disputes because every leader was, by definition, one of the most capable beings alive. A society of geniuses, building something together, protected from the things that usually tear civilizations apart. What it actually became was a place with slums, a place where some Ricks lived in comfortable homes while other Ricks worked factory jobs and could not afford anything better. A place where Mortys were treated as lesser beings by default, assigned roles beneath the Ricks, given less, expected to serve more. Their lives organized around the assumption that they were supporting characters in someone else's story. A place with corruption in its government, inequality in its streets, and an entire neighborhood, Morty Town, that functioned as the kind of place the people with power pretended not to see. It took a civilization of infinite geniuses almost no time at all to build something that looked exactly like everything they had supposedly left behind. This is not an accident. This is the show making a point. And the point is that the Citadel is not a failure of intelligence. It is a perfect expression of the values of the person who designed it. The Council of Ricks ran the Citadel for most of its early existence, and the Council was exactly what you would expect expect a government of Ricks to be? Each Rick on the council was convinced he was the most qualified person in the room. Each Rick had his own assessment of what the Citadel needed and his own vision for how it should be run. The result was a governing body that combined the absolute confidence of genius with the inflexibility of people who have never had to genuinely compromise on anything important. They made decisions. Those decisions were frequently self-serving. The structure they built protected Ricks at the top of it and was considerably less attentive to everything further down. Mortys had essentially no power in the Citadel's original structure. They were paired with Ricks, each Morty assigned to a Rick, serving as companion and cover, providing the brainwave interference that made Ricks harder to detect when they traveled. The relationship was framed as partnership. In practice, it was employment at best and something closer to ownership at worst. Mortys who ended up without a Rick, the Rickless Mortys as the show calls them, were given even fewer options. They ended up in Mortytown, which the show depicts as a place of poverty and neglect that the council's official version of the Citadel did not like to acknowledge. The police force was made up primarily of Ricks, which meant that when a Rick police officer killed his Morty partner, the consequences were minimal. The schools sorted Mortys into futures that did not include leadership or authority. The economy gave Ricks access to opportunities that Mortys could not reach. Every structure the council built reflected the same assumption, that Ricks were the point of the Citadel and Mortys were the support system. Rick C-137 had built a wall around the multiverse with himself at the center. The Council of Ricks had built a society with themselves at the center. The apple did not fall far from the tree. The first time the show gives the audience a deep look at the Citadel's interior life, Season 3, Episode 7, the episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, it does something unusual for Rick and Morty. It leaves Rick C-137 and Morty almost entirely out of the episode. Instead, it follows several different characters across the Citadel, each of them living some version of the life the institution had built for them. A Rick and Morty who are police partners, navigating what it means to be on the same side of a system that treats them differently by design. A Morty running for class president in a school that has never had a Morty in that position. A group of Ricks working a factory job that their intelligence should have placed them far above. A simple Rick. A Rick who gave up on scientific achievement to live a quiet family life, kept in a facility where his contentment is harvested to flavor a snack food product. Each of those stories is a different angle on the same observation. The Citadel took the most capable beings in their respective universes and sorted them into a hierarchy that wasted most of them. The factory Ricks were brilliant people doing manual labor. The school Morty was running against a system designed to prevent his kind from having a voice. The simple Rick was, in the most literal possible sense, being used as a resource. The Rick police officer was being asked to enforce rules that protected his kind at the expense of his partners. The episode does not editorialize. It just shows you what the place looks like when you walk its streets instead of looking at it from the official position of the council. And what it looks like is a mirror of every unjust society the show's audience has ever lived in, just made entirely of versions of two people, which makes the injustice impossible to explain away as a difference in ability or kind. Every Rick in the Citadel is equally smart. Every Morty in the Citadel is equally capable. The hierarchy is not based on merit. It is based on the original assumption built into the Citadel's foundation, that Ricks matter more. And that assumption was never examined because the people in charge of examining it were the same people benefiting from it. The Council of Ricks did not survive Season 3. Rick C-137, during his elaborate escape from the Galactic Federation's prison, used the chaos of his escape to do two things at once. He dismantled the Galactic Federation's economy, collapsing the organization that had been hunting him and his family by making its currency worthless overnight, and he killed the Council of Ricks, using the same operation to eliminate the governing body of the Citadel that had been acting as an institutional obstacle and occasional threat. The Citadel survived him doing this. It was damaged. It lost its government. It had to rebuild. But the infrastructure existed. The population existed. And the Ricks and Mortys who lived there had nowhere else to go. So they rebuilt. And as part of the rebuilding, they did something the Citadel had never done before. They held an election. The democratic process was new to the Citadel. The council had never been elected. It had simply organized itself from among the Ricks who were most willing to take on governance, which meant most willing to use governance for their own benefit. An actual election with actual candidates and actual votes was supposed to be different. Was supposed to mean that whoever ended up in charge actually had the support of the population, rather than just the confidence of the people already in power. The election produced a Morty. He campaigned on the things the Citadel had never given its Morty population: respect, equal treatment, a future that was not defined by which Rick they were were assigned to. He was charismatic in a way that Mortys were not supposed to be. He was confident in a way that made the Ricks who watched him uncomfortable, because the confidence looked unsettlingly like theirs. He won by a significant margin, and when he won, the Citadel had its first Morty president. What no one in the Citadel knew, what the audience sees but the characters do not, is that the Morty who won the election was not who he appeared to be. President Morty, before he was President Morty, had shown up once before in the series, Season 1, Episode 10. He was the figure behind a plan to kidnap Ricks and Mortys from across the multiverse, frame Rick C-137 for the crime, and use the whole operation to get close enough to C-137 to scan his brain. He had an eye patch. He had a Rick he had turned into a puppet using a control device hidden under that eye patch. He had a level of intelligence and forward planning that no Morty was supposed to have. He was evil Morty. And the election was not a political victory. It was the final step in a plan he had been running for a very long time. As president, evil Morty moved quickly. He eliminated the Shadow Council, the group of Ricks who had been running things behind the scenes after the Council of Ricks was destroyed, by having everyone in it killed at the first meeting where they showed resistance to his direction. He rewrote the rules of the Citadel's police force to give Rick officers the ability to kill their Morty partners without consequence, which sounds like a strange choice for a Morty president until you understand that he was not actually trying to improve life for Mortys. He was building towards something else entirely, and the reforms he made were either distractions or tools in service of a goal that had nothing to do with governance. Beneath the streets of the Citadel, out of sight of its population, evil Morty built a machine. It was powered partly by the bodies of Mortys who had been taken, used, discarded in the construction of something their president never told them about. The machine was designed to do one thing: punch through the central finite curve, to break the wall Rick had built to get out. Everything evil Morty had done, the kidnappings in Season 1, the election campaign, the presidency, the reforms, the secret construction, was in service of a single purpose. He had figured out what the Citadel was. He had figured out what the central finite curve was, and he had decided that the only acceptable response to living inside a cage, even a very large and well-appointed cage, was to leave it. The Citadel story ends the way Rick's story always ends, in collapse. When evil Morty finally activated his machine and broke through the curve, the energy released destroyed most of the Citadel. The portal guns of every Rick and Morty inside were hacked, their fluid contaminated so that any portal opened would lead somewhere lethal. The Operation Phoenix cloning system, which Ricks used to back up their consciousness and resurrect themselves after death, was redirected. The clones it was supposed to produce were instead fed into the machine as fuel. Most of the Ricks and Mortys in the Citadel died. The station itself was torn apart. Rick C-137 and Morty escaped by detaching one of the Citadel's smaller districts and flying it away from the destruction. Space Beth eventually found them, weeks later, drifting in space and close to dying of starvation. The civilization Rick had built as a side effect of a revenge mission, abandoned as soon as it stopped serving the mission, left to develop its own injustices and its own population of people living under rules they did not choose. That civilization was gone. What destroyed it was not an external enemy. It was not the Galactic Federation or some force from outside the curve. It was something born inside the Citadel itself. A Morty who grew up in the system the Citadel had built for Mortys, understood exactly what that system was, and decided that destroying the whole structure was more honest than trying to reform it. The Citadel was a society that mirrored its founder, and like its founder, it ended by producing something it could not contain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Morty who burned it down was not the last word in this story, because even after the Citadel was ash, evil Morty was still out there, past the curve, in the open multiverse, with plans the show had not yet finished revealing. And the weapon he would eventually acquire would make the destruction of the Citadel look like a small problem. Section 8. Evil Morty. What he actually is, and what he actually wanted. The show wants you to think evil Morty is a supervillain. It sets him up that way. The eye patch, the cold stare, the willingness to let people die in service of a plan that nobody around him fully understands. The way he shows up in Season 1 as a mystery, and keeps showing up across seasons as something that feels each time larger and more dangerous than the last time. The show gives him every visual and narrative signal associated with a great antagonist. And it does this deliberately, because the reveal it is building toward lands harder if you have spent years expecting a certain kind of character. Evil Morty is not a supervillain. He is the most understandable person in the entire show. Once the show finally tells you his actual origin story, in Season 7, in the episode called Unmortal, Mortican, the thing that lands is not how monstrous he is. It is how ordinary the beginning of his story was. He was a Morty. He went on adventures with his Rick. His Rick treated him the way Ricks treat Mortys, as a sidekick, as a tool, as someone whose feelings and safety and future were permanently secondary to whatever the Rick needed in any given moment. He got tired of it. That is the whole origin. He got tired of it, and he was smart enough and patient enough and cold enough to do something about it. Not a prophecy, not a secret experiment that gave him powers, not a tragedy that broke him in some unique way no other Morty had experienced. He was a Morty who reached the end of his patience with being a Morty, and he decided to stop. The mechanics of what he did first are worth understanding clearly. He got his Rick drunk. Blackout drunk, completely incapacitated. And while his Rick was in that state, Evil Morty built a device, a control mechanism hidden under an eye patch, and attached it to his Rick's brain. From that point forward, the Rick who appeared to be guiding their adventures was not making his own decisions. He was a puppet. Evil Morty was the one in control, using his Rick's face and voice and reputation as cover while he ran his own operation from behind the eye patch. The first thing he did with that cover was erase himself from the Citadel's records. He went to whatever office or system the Citadel used to track Mortys and removed himself from it. He no longer officially existed as far as the Citadel was concerned. A Morty who could not be tracked, who had no file, who appeared in no database. That was a Morty who could move. Then he built a base. Then he started gathering information. Then he started kidnapping Ricks from across the multiverse. Not to hurt them, but to extract knowledge from them. Specifically, knowledge about the Citadel's systems, its defenses, its internal structure. He was studying the institution that had defined his entire existence in order to find its weakest point. The show reveals all of this in Season 7, but the pieces were visible much earlier for anyone watching closely. His Season 1 appearance, where he was framing Rick C-137 for the kidnapping of multiple Ricks while using his puppet Rick as the visible face of the operation, was not a random crime. It was research. Getting Rick C-137 brought to the Citadel and then close enough to scan his brain was the goal. The brain scan was not completed in Season 1. Evil Morty was patient enough to wait several more seasons to finish it. What he needed from Rick C-137's brain specifically was the knowledge of how to break through the central finite curve. Evil Morty, at some point before his first appearance in the show, had figured out what the curve was. He had understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from being someone who lives at the bottom of a system and therefore sees it more honestly than the people at the top, that the accessible multiverse was not actually infinite, that there was a wall, that every Rick and every Morty who had ever used a portal gun had been moving around inside a container that Rick C-137 had built and never told anyone about. He understood what this meant for Mortys in a way that the show makes plain when he finally explains it out loud. Every Morty who ever lived inside the curve had spent their entire life in a portion of reality organized around the idea that Rick was the most important thing in it. Not their dimension specifically, the entire accessible multiverse. The thing that was supposed to represent freedom and infinite possibility and the ability to go anywhere was actually a very large room that someone else had built and closed off. Evil Mortys. Response to this understanding was the most logical response available to someone with his particular combination of intelligence and fury. He decided to leave. Not to reform the curve, not to expose it to the Citadel's population and let the political consequences play out, not to negotiate with Rick C-137 about whether the wall should exist. Just leave. Get out. Go to the part of the multiverse that was not organized around Rick's dominance and live there. This goal is so reasonable that the show has trouble making him the villain even when it is clearly trying to. Evil Morty does terrible things in service of this goal. He kills Ricks and Mortys in significant numbers. He runs the Citadel as a dictator and uses its population as resources for his machine. He is willing to cause enormous harm to accomplish what he is after. But what he is after is freedom. Basic, simple freedom from a system that was never designed with his well-being in mind. The show acknowledges this directly. When Evil Morty explains to Rick what the curve is and what it means for Mortys, Rick does not argue that he is wrong. Rick sits with it, because Evil Morty is not wrong. The relationship between Evil Morty and Rick C-137 in their final shared episode is one of the most carefully constructed things the show has produced. They are forced together by circumstances neither of them would have chosen. Both of them are hunting Rick Prime for overlapping but distinct reasons. Rick wants revenge for Diane. Evil Morty wants the Omega device, the weapon Rick Prime built that can erase someone from every dimension, because possessing its plans means possessing the ability to make himself impossible to touch. If he can threaten to use the Omega device on any Rick who comes after him, no Rick will come after him. The tool of Rick Prime's cruelty becomes Evil Morty's insurance policy. They work together. They fight together. They are, for the duration of that episode, something close to allies. Two people who dislike each other and have directly opposing interests, but need each other to get through the immediate problem alive. After Rick Prime is dead, after Rick finally gets the moment he spent decades working toward, Evil Morty takes the Omega device plans and prepares to leave. And before he goes, he says something to Rick that functions as the closest thing to a genuine statement of intent the character ever delivers. He says he could end the Rick experiment right now if he wanted to. He has the Omega device plans. He could build the weapon and use it to erase every Rick from every dimension simultaneously and be done with it. He is choosing not to. Not because he has developed any warmth toward Ricks, or toward Rick C-137 specifically, but because doing so would make him exactly what he has been trying to escape, a person whose entire existence is defined by their relationship to Rick. He does not want to be the Morty who destroyed all Ricks. He wants to be a person with no relationship to Rick at all. Then he tells Rick to leave him alone, and if Rick does not leave him alone, the Omega device is still an option. Evil Morty's real meaning in the show is not as an antagonist, it is as a mirror. He shows you what the Rick and Morty dynamic looks like from the Morty side when the Morty is honest about it and has the intelligence and will to refuse it. Every Morty in the Citadel, every Morty across the infinite dimensions of the central finite curve, was living some version of what Evil Morty refused to keep living. Most of them did not have the self-awareness to name it. Most of them did not have the capacity to do anything about it even if they could name it. Evil Morty had both, and what he chose to do with both was not revenge, not destruction for its own sake. He burned the Citadel down because the Citadel was the machine maintaining the cage, and the cage needed to come down before he could leave. The burning was not the goal, the leaving was the goal. He is the most coherent character in the show because he is the only one whose stated purpose, actual behavior, and final outcome all point in the same direction. He said he wanted out, he built toward getting out, he got out. What he is doing now, somewhere beyond the central finite curve, in the open multiverse where Rick is not automatically the smartest thing alive, the show has not yet shown us. He has the Omega device plans, he has his freedom. He has a warning hanging over Rick's head that functions as the closest thing to peace between them that either of them is capable of. And while Evil Morty was busy burning down the Citadel and finding his way out, Rick C-137 was still pointed at the original problem, the one that started everything, the one that had been waiting across the multiverse for decades, not caring that Rick was coming, not afraid of what was on its way. Quote _7 Rick Prime had been out there the whole time, and the confrontation that had been building since a bomb went off in a garage was finally about to arrive. Section 9. Rick Prime versus Rick C-137, the revenge that fixed nothing. For as long as the show has existed, the confrontation with Rick Prime has felt inevitable. Everything in Rick C-137's history points toward it. The bomb in the garage, the decades of hunting, the killing fields, the Citadel built as a trap that failed, the central finite curve drawn as a net that could not hold the target, the years of sitting in Prime's abandoned dimension waiting for a man who was never going to come home. Every choice Rick made after losing Diane was either directly about finding Rick Prime or a consequence of the person he became while looking. The show builds this anticipation carefully across seasons. It drops Prime into the background of Rick's origin story in Season 3, confirms him as a real and active threat in Season 6, and then spends Season 7 making the chase feel genuinely dangerous. By the time the two of them are finally in the same room, the audience has been waiting for this moment across years of real time and decades of in-story time. The weight of it is enormous, and then it happens, and Rick loses. The episode where Rick finally confronts Rick Prime, Season 7, Episode 5, called Unmortricken, does not play the confrontation as a triumph. It plays it as something far more uncomfortable than that. Rick and Morty had been running a scheme to draw Prime out, using the disruption Evil Morty had caused to the central finite curve as a way to flush him from hiding. The plan worked, in the loose sense that Rick Prime was eventually located, but Rick got too close too fast, and the result was that Rick, Morty, and several other Ricks got pulled into a trap that Prime had prepared, a prison built specifically for Ricks who had been hunting him. Inside the prison, Rick Prime appeared on a screen to explain what he had built. He had gathered Ricks who were all after him for the same reason. All of them had lost their Dianes to the Omega device. All of them were running the same revenge mission Rick C-137 had been running. All of them had dedicated significant portions of their lives to finding the man responsible. And Prime had collected them, trapped them together, and offered them a deal. Fight each other, last one standing gets Diane back. Rick C-137 knew immediately that this was a lie. Prime could not bring Diane back. The Omega device had erased her from every every dimension. There was no version of her left to return. The offer was not a real offer. It was a test of whether grief could be weaponized into making Ricks kill each other. Most of the other Ricks in the prison did not listen to C-137's warning. They were too deep in their own pain, too desperate to believe the offer might be real, and they turned on each other. Rick and Evil Morty, who had shown up uninvited, pulled into the situation by his own interest in the Omega device plans, had to fight their way through the resulting chaos. What the prison sequence reveals about Rick Prime is important to sit with. He built an elaborate trap for Ricks who were hunting him. He stocked it with a version of Diane's face and personality as the final obstacle, a mechanical creation wearing his dead ex-wife's likeness, designed to destroy the Ricks who made it through the others. He had thought extensively about how to hurt the specific people who were coming after him, and he had built the hurt into architecture. The show hints at what this means. Rick Prime claimed he did not care about anything. He presented himself as the purest version of the Rick philosophy: total freedom, zero attachment, nothing and no one mattering. But a man who truly did not care would not build a trap that used Diane as its weapon. You do not weaponize something that means nothing to you. The specific cruelty of using her face, her voice, her personality as the final obstacle in a killing machine designed for Ricks who loved her, that is not indifference. That is a man who understands exactly how much she mattered and uses that understanding as a blade. Rick Prime spent an enormous amount of energy thinking about Diane. The show makes this visible without making it explicit, and the implication is the same one that ran through the earlier analysis of why he used the Omega device on her across all dimensions. He was not free of her. He was as defined by her absence as Rick C-137 was. He just expressed it through destruction instead of grief. Rick and Evil Morty escaped the prison by combining their knowledge and their modified portal guns to find a way out. And then Rick finally got what he had been working toward for decades. He found Rick Prime. The fight that followed was not clean. Rick Prime was not simply waiting to be defeated. He had body modifications, technological upgrades built into his body that made him physically dangerous beyond what raw intelligence alone would produce. He had backup clones, additional versions of himself stored and ready to activate if the original body was destroyed. He had the Omega device ready to use. He had spent a long time thinking about what to do if someone ever actually got to him. Rick fought him. Morty fought alongside him. Evil Morty joined the fight when he understood that Prime with the Omega device was a threat to his own freedom as much as anyone else's. The three of them together, one Rick driven by decades of grief, one Morty driven by self-interest, and one grandson who was there because he could not let his grandfather face this alone, pushed Rick Prime to the edge. Evil Morty finished it, not Rick. Evil Morty got Rick Prime incapacitated by doing something Rick Prime did not expect. He pretended to be regular Morty. He walked up to Prime acting like an ordinary, non-threatening Morty, the kind of Morty Prime had always dismissed as beneath his attention, and the performance worked. Prime, for just a moment, dropped his guard. He even seemed caught off balance by the idea of meeting what he thought was his real, original grandson. That moment of hesitation was enough. Evil Morty disabled Prime's body modifications and eliminated his backup clones. Then Evil Morty stepped back. He pulled Rick C-137 into the room, and he left Rick alone with the man he had been hunting for decades. Helpless, no backups, nowhere to go. Rick beat Rick Prime to death. This is where the show does the thing that separates it from a simpler revenge story. It does not let the moment feel good. Rick Prime, in his final moments, did not beg, did not apologize, did not give Rick the thing that revenge is supposed to produce: the acknowledgement, the recognition of the wrong, the moment where the person who caused all the pain finally understands the scale of what they did. Prime mocked Rick all the way to the end. He called him Dead Wife Rick. He laughed. He was, even in his last moments, committed to the posture of not caring, even if the evidence suggested otherwise. And Rick, who had spent 40 plus years and infinite dimensions working toward this moment, stood in the aftermath of it and felt nothing that resembled relief. The grief did not lift. Diane was not less gone. The decades of drinking and killing and running and refusing to let himself fully live, none of that was returned to him by the death of the man responsible for it. The wound had been open so long that closing the cause of it did not close the wound. He was left purposeless, in a way he had not been since the bomb went off. The hunt had been the structure holding his life together. The hunt had been, in the most uncomfortable sense, the replacement for everything he had lost. Without Diane, he needed something to point himself at. And Rick Prime had been that thing for so long that removing it left nothing behind. He stuffed those feelings down, he drank, he carried on, he did what Rick C-137 has always done when the thing he is feeling is too large to look at directly. He performed not caring and moved to the next problem. But he let Evil Morty walk away with the Omega device plans. In the moment when he could have stopped him, when Rick Prime himself pointed out that Evil Morty was leaving with something dangerous, Rick chose the kill over the chase. He let Evil Morty go because in that moment, nothing mattered except finishing what he came to do. He got his revenge. And Evil Morty got the most dangerous weapon in the multiverse's blueprints. The trade Rick made without meaning to make it would hang over everything that came after. The revenge solved nothing and cost something. That is the honest summary of Season 7's central arc. Rick got the moment he built his entire post-Diane life around. He got to look Rick Prime in the face and be the last one standing. And on the other side of that moment was not peace or closure or a new chapter that felt meaningfully different from the old one. It was just the same grief in a room where the target was finally gone. What came after, what Season 8 spent its time on, was the question of whether Rick could do anything useful with a life that no longer had revenge as its organizing principle. Whether the man who had been the Rickest Rick for 40 years could figure out how to be something smaller and quieter and more honest than that. __quote_8__. The answer the show found for that question is the most unexpectedly tender thing it has ever produced. And it involves a memory and a choice and a version of Diane that should not exist but does. Section 10, the Season 8 finale and where Rick stands now. Memory, Diane, and the road into Season 9. After everything, it comes down to a memory on a shooting range. Not a battle, not a confrontation with some new threat from across the multiverse, not Rick engineering his way out of an impossible situation with a device he built in 30 seconds from spare parts. Just a memory. A single remaining fragment of a woman who has been gone for 40 years, existing in the deepest part of Rick's mind, doing target practice in what looks like somewhere with a southwestern sky behind her. This is what the Omega device left behind. Rick Prime built a weapon capable of erasing someone from every dimension simultaneously, and he used it on Diane, and it worked on everything except one thing, one memory. One small scene that survived the erasure somehow, sitting in Rick's mind like the last photograph in a burning house. The rest of Diane, every version of her, every memory of her, every trace of her presence in the minds of the people who loved her, was gone. But this one image stayed. Rick had been carrying it for years without fully knowing what to do with it. Season 8 is about what he finally does. By the time Season 8 begins, Rick is in a specific place emotionally that the show takes care to establish clearly. Rick Prime is dead. The revenge is done. The purpose that structured 40 years of Rick's life has been completed and found to be empty, the way the show always suggested it would be. Rick is still drinking, Rick is still performing not caring, but something underneath the performance has shifted, a loosening, barely visible, of the iron grip he has kept on himself since the garage. He is trying to move forward. Not successfully, not cleanly, but trying in the stumbling way that Rick tries things he does not have a framework for. He has started spending more time with Beth. This is confirmed across Season 8, Rick making genuine efforts to be present as a father in ways he was not before. The show reveals in Season 8 that Rick had a lonely childhood himself, that he always wanted love and closeness from the people around him and never knew how to ask for it directly. This detail is not a retcon of who Rick is. It is the missing piece that makes the whole picture make sense. The man who pushes everyone away has always been the man who most needed someone to stay. He has also started seeing someone, a former associate named Bug Ann. The relationship is casual by Rick's design. He is not ready for anything more than that, and he knows it, and Bug Ann knows it too. She tells him directly that she knows why he cannot fully show up for her. He has not moved on from Diane. After 40 years and an act of revenge and the literal erasure of her from all of reality, Rick is still in the garage in some part of himself, still the man who chose her over everything. The Season 8 finale, the episode called Hot Rick, begins with Rick and Bug Ann and the problem that has been sitting underneath Season 8's entire emotional arc. Rick mentions, almost in passing, that the Omega device did not just erase Diane from existence, it damaged the memories of the people who loved her. Beth does not really remember her mother. She has the feeling of having had one, the vague outline of a presence, but the specific person, Diane's face, her voice, her particular way of being in a room, is gone from Beth's memory, replaced by something the show describes as a featureless blur. Rick himself only has fragments, the single image on the shooting range, pieces that do not fully connect into the person they were pieces of. Beth only thinks she remembers her mother. That line lands differently the longer you sit with it. A daughter who grew up with the grief of an absent father, Rick Prime, who left, and who also now carries a grief she cannot fully access. A mother she cannot quite see in her own memory. The Omega device did not just kill Diane, it stole her from the people who needed to be able to remember her. The episode's central complication arrives when Jerry starts behaving strangely. He has warm memories of Rick being a loving, present father figure, memories that are clearly false, that no one else in the family shares, that could not have happened given everything we know about Rick's history with the family. Rick investigates and finds the source, Memory Rick. Memory Rick is a version of Rick that the show introduced in an earlier Season 8 episode. He is a younger, softer version of Rick, the Rick that existed in Bird Person's memories, the Rick from before the rampage had fully made him into what he became. He is kinder than present-day Rick, more openly loving, a Rick who had not yet built all the armor. Memory Rick had gotten stranded inside Jerry's mind during a previous adventure and had been living there since, unable to get out. In the way that only a Rick could manage, he had responded to being trapped in Jerry's extremely simple mental landscape by quietly rewriting Jerry's memories of the past to include himself as a warm and present father figure. He inserted himself into Jerry's recollections of family moments that never happened. He became, inside Jerry's memory, the Rick that the family deserved. When Rick discovers this and begins pulling Memory Rick out of Jerry's mind, Memory Rick finds something he was not supposed to find. He finds the last surviving memory of Diane, the shooting range image, the single fragment the Omega device could not reach, sitting in Rick's mind, where Rick had been keeping it without fully examining it. Memory Rick, being a version of Rick who still has full access to his feelings about Diane, reacts the way present-day Rick cannot let himself react. He wants to save her. He wants the memory preserved. He wants the last piece of her to survive. What follows is Memory Rick maneuvering Beth, brainwashing her, the show is honest about this, into trying to find and retrieve the Diane memory from Rick's mind, convincing her that recovering her mother is worth the risk. Memory Rick is a kinder Rick, but he is still a Rick, which means he is still capable of manipulating the people he loves in service of what he believes is right for them. The situation becomes genuinely dangerous. Beth, under Memory Rick's influence, ends up in a confrontation with Space Beth that turns deadly, the brainwashing pushing her past the point of control. The plan falls apart. Memory Rick's attempt to rescue Diane through Beth nearly costs both Beths their lives. Rick ends it the way Rick ends most things, by showing up and being honest in the specific, small way he is capable of being honest. He finds Beth at the edge of a terrible decision, brainwashed, armed, convinced by Memory Rick that the only way to keep the family together is to take an action she cannot come back from. And instead of engineering a solution, or building a device, or being clever about it, Rick just talks to her. He tells her that the memories they have of Diane, the fragments, the blur, the shooting range image, are skewed the way all memories are skewed. That the real Diane would never have agreed to hijack her daughter's mind to save a version of herself that was already just a memory. That he knows this because he remembers enough of her to know what she would and would not do. Then he does the thing that the whole season has been building toward. He goes into his own mind, finds the last surviving memory of Diane, and removes it deliberately. He transfers it out of his own memory so that he can move forward, so that he can be more open, more present, more capable of actually showing up for the people around him, rather than spending every moment of every day carrying a grief so heavy it prevents him from fully living. He chooses, after 40 years, to let go, but he does not destroy it. Instead, Rick drives to an empty patch of space and opens a small container, a little enclosed environment he has built, something like a tiny habitat floating in the dark. Inside are Memory Rick and the memory of Diane, now existing as their own separate presences, aware of each other, able to interact. He has not killed them, he has given them to each other. Memory Rick and Memory Diane get the ending that Rick C-137 and the real Diane never got. They get to exist together, somewhere quiet, in a small space Rick built for them, free of the weight of everything that happened after the garage. It is the closest thing to a happy ending that this story contains, and it belongs to memories rather than the actual people. Rick ejects the container into space, he watches it go, and then he calls Bug Ann. This is where Rick stands as Season 9 begins. He has killed Rick Prime, he has released the last memory of Diane. He has made genuine efforts toward Beth, toward being present, toward being the father he was not capable of being while revenge was still the organizing principle of his life. He is trying, imperfectly, inconsistently, in the way that people who have spent decades running from something try when they finally stop running, to live in the present. Evil Morty is still out there. He has the Omega device plans. He told Rick to leave him alone, and Rick so far has. And the arrangement holds the way arrangements between two people who could destroy each other tend to hold, carefully, with everyone aware of what the alternative looks like. The Season 9 trailer describes all of this with a line that is funnier than it deserves to be, given everything. 100 years of Rick Rick and Morty continues. It is a joke about how long the show has been running. It is also, if you have followed the lore from the garage to the empty patch of space where Memory Rick and Memory Diane now float together, a surprisingly accurate description of what this story has actually been. 100 years of one man refusing to let go. And then, finally, slowly, in the most Rick way possible, by removing the memory surgically and giving it its own little home in space, beginning to. Season 9 is the first season of Rick and Morty that does not have revenge as its spine. The first one, where Rick is not, on some level, still the man in the burning garage. What the show does with that, what Rick does with a life that finally belongs to him, rather than to the hunt, is the question that 24 episodes of build-up have been quietly asking all along. And somewhere past the central finite curve, in a part of the multiverse where Rick is not automatically the most important thing alive, a Morty with an eye patch is sitting with the plans for a weapon that could end the Rick experiment once and for all. The 100 years are not finished yet. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.